Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, Jonathan Steele. The Central African Republic has experienced a year of terror since Muslim rebels seized power in the capital Bangui, overthrowing a government that largely consisted of Christians. Christian militias retaliated with unprecedented ferocity. Thousands have been killed in Bangui and other cities, 1 million have fled their homes, and almost all of the capital's Muslims have fled. Mosques have been torched, and Muslim shops and homes have been burnt to the ground. Foreign peacekeeping troops, including French, European Union and African Union forces, have been deployed in an attempt to maintain order, but the killings continue, and concerns have been raised that troop numbers aren't sufficient. The UN also estimates that some 6,000 child soldiers may now be involved in the conflict. In this first half of the programme, we'll be looking at how the conflict has evolved and what the future holds for this resource-rich, landlocked country and its different ethnic and religious communities. In the second half, we'll be turning our attention to the humanitarian issue and the role of relief organisations and the dangers and challenges that they face. Joining me in the studio to discuss this are James Schneider, Editor-in-Chief of Think Africa Press, Kassim Kayira, a journalist at the BBC, Paul Melly, Associate Fellow in the Africa Programme at Chatham House, and on the phone we have Xavier Châtel, a spokesperson of the French Embassy in the United Kingdom. Welcome to you all. But first, let's take a look at this report.
Muslim and Christian relatives of a teenager murdered in the Central African Republic gathered at a mosque in the capital Bangui to mourn him last week. In another sign of how bloody the ethnic conflict in the region has become, a Muslim teenager was kidnapped and killed, with his body beheaded and dismembered.
There
is no security in the third neighborhood. They say the peacekeepers are here, but they are not many. Why do we guard the areas where there is peace? But here they kill people. But nobody speaks out against this. Even the president. She is not saying anything about us here.
The act underscores the huge task ahead for the European peacekeeping forces, who took over the Bangui airport on Wednesday at the start of their mission in the Central African Republic. Only about 150 EU troops have arrived so far, but according to the EU, the strength of the force is expected to continue building until it reaches its target of 1,000 soldiers in June.
For the moment, no date has been fixed for the deployment of European forces in the different neighbourhoods of Bangui, but in time that's what's going to happen.
In the meantime, charities and NGOs are struggling to contain the violence. Doctors Without Borders has now suspended all but emergency care in the Central African Republic to show its dismay at the government's failure to condemn the killing of 16 people at one of its clinics. 3 MSF staff members were amongst those killed.
Yeah, on Saturday at the end of the afternoon, a group of men of ex-Seleka entered the town of Bugila and completely surrounded our compound. They proceeded to loot and steal some of the materials, computers, etc. And during this period of time, unfortunately, an incident was provoked whereby they shot at unarmed civilians that were within our compound.
Thousands of Muslims have fled Bangui since the onset of the attacks. Outside the capital city, entire towns have been emptied of Muslims, who once accounted for over 15% of the population. UN peacekeeping efforts have been welcomed by all sides in the conflict. However, NGOs and charities have stressed the need to act fast to avoid an irreversible humanitarian tragedy. Flaminia Giambalvo, Islam Channel.
Well, Xavier Châtel, let me start with you. I mean, what has France been able to achieve? I mean, we are seeing pictures there of very, very considerable violence still continuing.
Hi, Jonathan, and thank you for having me. I think the first thing we should remind to your listeners and viewers is that when we intervened about a year ago, it was to prevent the situation from spiraling completely out of control. And what you're seeing today probably would be compounded, I don't know how many times, had we not intervened. I think we have prevented much worse when we intervened. That's the first point. The second point is, if you see the picture as it emerges now, there are many difficulties. There is violence which is escalating in some areas, and the French troops are facing it on a daily basis. However, first, we have been able to deploy a French force of about 2,000 troops, which has been steadily increasing. Recently, the president announced 2 months ago that we were increasing it by 400 people. Second, we have facilitated also the deployment of an African force under a UN mandate, so it required the UN Security Council to authorize it, and they have deployed now about 6,000 troops, including 600 police, and that was in a very, very short time. So in terms of the normal UN pace, that was really, really an achievement. And the third point is the UN Security Council has recently agreed that this force, in the face of all the difficulties which are continuing in the Central African Republic, this force would be increased further to up to 12,000 troops, and that will happen by September.
And what about the European Union? I mean, we hear that there are 150 troops. I mean, is that meant to increase, and to what number?
Okay, the EU has authorized the deployment of a force. So far, there's the French contingent of about 150 that you mentioned has already deployed in the theater, and we're expecting more troops. I think the Estonians and also the Georgians will be deployed as they are committed by the relevant nations. So there's going to be a steady build-up of that force too. Yeah, as you know, this force will certainly not be of the same scale as either the French force or the African force. The main force which is going to take over is the UN peacekeeping force, which is going to consist mainly of African forces, African troops. And this is normal because fundamentally this is a classic case for a UN peacekeeping operation. So it's typically the sort of setting to which they are accustomed and the sort of environment in which they have a lot of experience, and not only on the military side but also on the political side and on the development side. And I think these three elements are extremely important, because in order to stabilize the situation, it's not only about defeating armed groups, it's not only about disarming, but it's also about getting the state authority to be extended across the country, its legitimacy recognized, getting public services to work for the population, and also obtaining a political solution. So there should be normally, according to the UN Security Council, there should be elections by February of 2015. So this needs to be organized. You need to prepare for it. You need an electoral code. You need an electoral commission. You need a census, and all these things take time to.
Well, let me put some of these points to Kassim Kayira. I mean, do you feel that the forces have really done a good job, and have they been disarming people or just protecting some civilians?
I think it's a kind of a mixed picture, because to an extent, some of the French forces especially have done a bit, but it's not enough, unfortunately, because given the numbers, what they've managed to do is stop the situation escalating so much, but the situation is bad as it is. People are still dying, even in areas which are very close to peacekeepers, and we have witnessed these particular cases where people have been killed despite being as close as possible to peacekeepers.
What have they done to disarm the militants on both sides?
In terms of disarmament, I think that is one that hasn't really happened. I think they needed to, first of all, bring back a sense of government in place for them to be able to start disarming. When the French troops went in 1 year ago, they were very quick to disarm a lot of the former C.A.R rebels. But many of the disarmament plans were actually voluntary disarmament by the C.A.R rebels themselves. They brought about 4,500, came and handed over their weapons to the French, on the agreement, on the understanding that they would be either integrated into the new national force or alternatively be given a package to go back home. That hasn't happened. Right now you have 4,500, actually there are 6,000 former Seleka rebels in the capital city in Bangui in a military camp. Some of them still with few weapons. They've lost the bigger weapons, but they still have some weapons, who are very, very dissatisfied with the process so far, not being integrated into the national army, not given a package to go back home. This particular group could be actually a source of insecurity. They are still in the middle of the capital, and that is a problem from what I can see.
Well, James Schneider, I mean, a lot of the protection of civilians actually is kind of ethnic cleansing. It's helping them to escape from the country altogether. I mean, that's not really a real solution, is it?
Well, it's not a long-term solution, but I mean, if the communities are under attack and the best solution that you have available to stop them being killed is moving them, and they've requested to leave. There are still some Muslims in Bangui who haven't asked to leave, but many of the ones who have left have requested to leave because they've been under threat. I think it would be unfair to suggest that the AU troops or the French troops were kind of facilitating ethnic cleansing by removing people for their own protection for the time. They haven't removed them because they want them to never return. They've not removed them because they want Muslims out of Bangui for particular operational reasons. It's because they have limited capacity. At the moment, there are not enough troops, there's not enough of a policing contingent. They can't bring stability and security fully to the capital, let alone the rest of the country. And so this is a sad and unpleasant but a necessary stopgap.
And Paul Melly, I mean, what do you see as the next step? I mean, just more troops, will that just make a big difference, or is there qualitative change that needs to happen in the way this is being handled?
Well, I think one of the key things that will come with the UN mission is the process of trying to rebuild the state. And if we look at the contrast with Mali, there you had a functioning state. So once the international intervention happened, areas that were restored to civilian control rapidly returned, with one or two small exceptions, to relative peace and order, because people are used to a functioning state, administration, they respect judges, there are trained officials, etc., etc. The Central African Republic has a 20 or 30-year history of instability and very, very weak governance. Probably for about 15 years, the authority of the state beyond Bangui has been either non-existent or very weak. State structures are very, very fragile and in many places hardly existed even before the present crisis. So that's created the space, if you like, for this crisis to spread, this conflict to spread at community level. And that's where perhaps we can see that just sending in the military intervention hasn't been enough. You will need more troops, certainly, but what's really got to take place is a long-term process of actually rebuilding basic social structures and basic public administration and a state that works, that hasn't been there for 20 or 30 years.
Well, Xavier Chatel, are you still there? Yes, I just wondered if you can go back a little bit to the origins of all this. I mean, Muslims have been living there for years, decades, in Central African Republic. What suddenly sparked this terrible religious hatred and clashes, just in the last few years?
Well, I mean, I think as Paul and James had been saying, there used to be a history of political of reasonable coexistence between the different groups in the Central African Republic. That is not to say that there's been a history of stability. We have had to intervene on several occasions to protect our citizens in a country which was suffering some convulsions. I think the element which really tipped the balance was the coup which happened, and you have to remember that it's a country in which there's the minorities are not even, they're not even in numbers, and but for us as a country which has deep ties of I would say common history and affection rather than interest in the Central African Republic, that has been something which made it absolutely indispensable for us to act, because we couldn't let this country literally collapsing, basically.
Kasim, I mean, can you say something about the sort of religious tensions and so on? I mean, or is the Western media exaggerating or even getting it wrong by talking about Christians, Muslims all the time?
I don't know whether it has been over-exaggerated, but probably, for me, it's more than just the religious, and it's more than just ethnicity and religion. It looks like it's more politics, but which has been facilitated by the lack of, either politicians are benefiting from, coining the whole point as being religious and so on, because we've had rebellions before. And there were Muslims as part of the rebellions. For example, Miskin, General Miskin, who is very, very well known. In fact, there is a whole area in Bangui that is named after him, a particular area called Miskin. There have been Muslims there as rebels, as part of, well, not involved seriously in government. But it has never happened to get to the point where now this ethnic, or this particular religious killings have come to this particular point. It's until the Seleka rebels took power, and then they accuse the Seleka rebels, many of whom were Muslims, the majority of whom were Muslims, of committing these atrocities. As a result of that, revenge has come in. But I think it is coming to a very illiterate population, to a very huge number of youth who are unemployed. Therefore, this kind of chaos now has become a source of employment, because you go, you loot someone's home, you come back with the iron sheets, you come back with the doors, you sell them on the markets, and you can see it is door number 53, which came from someone's area that you know. So this has become a source of employment. They are thriving on the chaos that is there right now. So for me, yes, the religious element is there. It's unfortunate people are dying in these huge numbers, but it has political roots that have turned now into the religion.
And economic, as you've pointed out.
Yes, economic and
fantastic
and
unemployment.
political.
I mean, how do you see the thing playing out in the next 6 months or a year?
Well, I think it depends how successful the policing element and the state-building element of the UN force is, and also what type of funding is given for humanitarian relief and how much money is put by the outside world into things like seeds and tools for growing crops. Because the hunger situation is, as Kasim was saying, one of the driving forces of the violence. And if that isn't addressed, and if the humanitarian care is not stepped up, and if some semblance of some state activities, mainly being police stations and prisons, are not able to be brought forward, then what we'll see is this continuing.
Well, what about the President? I mean, we've talked about aid agencies, the UN, EU, African Union. You've mentioned state activity a little bit there. But, I mean, does the President really command any authority? Can she try and stop these anti-Muslim pogroms going on by, issuing good advice and recommendations and so on?
Not really. I mean, she was probably quite a cross-party choice, if you like, to be the interim president until elections are held. She has connections to Chad, but she also has connections to Christian communities, so she could bridge the divide to some extent. But the whole of the political class has really lost credibility over many, many years. There's been a sort of contrast in the C.A.R. over the last 2 or 3 decades, that in Bangui you do have a small group of political and media people who are very active, and civil servants, trade unions, that sort of thing. But what it hasn't done is really reach out to the wider population. The politicians have given the impression of being largely disconnected, if you like, from the different segments of population that they might hope to represent. And also, the situation's compounded by the C.A.R.'s geographical situation. People always talk about it being resource-rich, but the uranium that people talk about is merely indications of mineral deposits. Nobody's producing uranium. It's in the ground. It's not part of the economy yet. There are diamonds, which, as we saw in Sierra Leone, for example, or in DRC, can be extraordinarily destabilizing, because you just dig them out of the ground and you can't stop smuggling in diamonds. They're very easily traded. They can be used to finance armed groups. And then in what should be what you would call the normal functioning economy of a typical francophone tropical African country, sectors like coffee and cotton production, timber production, because the country's landlocked and so far from the sea, it's at a huge competitive disadvantage to all the other producers of these same crops, so that attempts to make the cotton sector or the coffee sector viable are always held back by the fact that the transport costs are much higher than they would be for competing countries on the African coast. So there's an absolutely massive development challenge. It's really extraordinarily difficult to see how the C.A.R. can be built into an economy that really can generate what you might call an acceptable, decent standard of living at today's modern African level. It's really difficult.
Well, on that rather sad note, we'll have to end the first half. In the second half, we'll be joined by two people from the aid agencies, and we'll be concentrating exactly on these issues of development and humanitarian aid. So stay with us.